Welcome to This Week in Space, our Humans to Mars edition, part 1. We'll be looking at how we'll reach the red planet, progress on the Space Launch System moon rocket, SpaceX challenges, and Webb Space Telescope politics. Stay with us.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 7, recorded on April 15th, 2022, Humans to Mars. This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV has everything you need to level up your IT skills while you enjoy the journey. Visit itpro.tv/twit for an additional 30% off all consumer subscriptions for the lifetime of your active subscription when you use code TWIT30 at checkout. And by Blue Land. Sometimes, in order to go green, you've got to go blue. Blue Land, that is. Blue Land was founded on the belief that a cleaner planet starts by reducing waste while creating powerful, effective cleaners for your entire home. You can get 20% off your first order when you go to blueland.com/space. Hello, and thanks for joining us for another Rock'em Sock'em episode of This Week in Space. I'm Rod Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine for the National Space Society, and I'm joined by Mr. Orbital Velocity himself, Tariq Malik, editor-in-chief at space.com. How you doing, Tariq?
I finally made it back from Colorado, so I'm glad to be here in one piece after that debacle. Last
All right.
episode.
Well, you should tell us why you were in Colorado so we don't get the wrong idea.
That's right. I went to the National Space Symposium, the 37th annual. That's the biggest space industry event in the United States, arguably for the year. And at that time, basically NASA, all of their partners, the military, all of the space companies, all descend on Colorado Springs for a week and talk about their big plans. So I met with Peter Beck at Rocket Lab. I met with the folks at Amazon. It was a pretty good talk, but very busy. But if you're a big space geek like me, it's a dreamland. Getting back when they shut down your airport on the way tends to be a bit more of a challenge, but we were able to make it work after a stopover in Chicago, actually.
Well, I'm guessing that you were there because your publication, I underscore your publication, sends you there.
Yes.
Which mine does not. So just saying,
I was, this was the first time in 3 years that I've been able to go to Symposium because of the pandemic. And of course it was canceled for a couple of years and then had a smaller turnout, I think last year. I also hosted a panel with the NOAA administrator and several others about climate data. So that was really insightful to learn really like what big data means for climate science and what the future might hold for companies that are trying to get into that market, either providing new climate data for the government and other folks to use to plan how you're going to build your house, where you're going to shore up your beaches, that sort of thing, for the future. Because it's everything from internet connectivity for those sensors that NOAA has out in the ocean, all the way on up to big data products that you would use to find out where your floodplains may need to be rejiggered, or your fire things need to be your fire warnings need to be set. So,
or if you live where I do in Southern California, all of the above. Because
That's right.
We're having the wildfire decade. We're bound to have earthquakes anytime soon, and the ocean is encroaching on my backyard. Well, I appreciate you doing that. And this is going to come as a surprise, but I have a joke for you. Oh
yes. I'm always open for a Rod Pyle.
Hey Tariq, I hear Mars has just 38% of Earth's gravity. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Very scientifically accurate.
I'm no longer overweight. I'm just living on the wrong planet.
I love it.
Thank God we're done with that.
I identify with that joke. So.
Yeah, me too. More and more. Actually, I'm feeling, when I worked up at Griffith Observatory in my misspent youth, we had scales for all the planets. So you could step on the Earth scale and find out the sad truth. Then you could step on the Moon scale and, be 16% and so forth. And I always enjoyed getting on Jupiter because it made me feel thin when I got off. Because I think on Jupiter I was 940 pounds or 1,100 pounds or something, which is closer to today. Well, we have a lot to cover today because we're talking about humans to Mars as other people have been talking about for 70 years.
70 years, I found out today.
Yeah. But first, let's jump into some headlines. So let's update the Space Launch System wet dress. Now, you've been covering this more closely than I have. So, Tariq, I'm gonna hand this one off to you. But let's just say we've had a few delays, which we expect from NASA launches and launch simulations and fueling tests, as we're doing here. But what the heck's going on? We were supposed to be done 2 weeks ago.
We were supposed to be done 2 weeks ago. So basically, NASA is about 2 weeks into a 3-day test right now for the Space Launch System.
Oh, that's harsh.
And I don't mean to be harsh. It is a brand new system, and you would expect glitches along the way. But essentially, NASA has been trying to do what they call a wet dress rehearsal. It's a countdown test. They're going to simulate everything from the last few days of countdown, and then they end with this physical fueling. They're going to like gas up the rocket with its 537,000 gallons of propellant, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, and then kind of stop at the last minute and say, okay, what did we learn from that? And NASA has been having a lot of problems on the technical side at the pad with the fueling process itself. They've tried it now, as of our speaking today, 3 separate times, most recently yesterday. And they've had to stop before they've completed this fueling process because of, in the beginning, it was some technical issues on the pad. Then there was a stuck vent, like the equipment they used to open up a vent to keep everything pressurized properly wasn't working, so they couldn't actually move the vent. And now they've got a liquid hydrogen leak on the pad structure itself too, which of course they really don't need because that's the propellant for the rocket. You don't want that leaking around. And they're trying to figure out what to do. They even had to scale back the test for this third attempt where they weren't going to try to fuel the entire rocket, which has a massive core stage and then an upper stage on top. They were just trying to do the core stage, that first part, this third time, and they couldn't get that one complete either. So there is, as we're talking for this episode, there will be an update from NASA, and we expect them to list out what they're going to do, if they're going to just stay on the pad as they have been for the duration of this test, or if they're going to kind of pack it up, roll it back into the VAB, the Vehicle Assembly Building, its hangar, and then maybe try it again at a later date. That would add a lot of time if they really need to get this test complete. But NASA and SpaceX have another rocket ready to launch on April 23rd that they do need to get off because that's going to carry a new crew to the International Space Station. It's on a SpaceX Falcon 9. And they've already had to rejigger with another SpaceX crew launch to the space station, the AX-1 private mission that we spoke about earlier. And so there's a lot of kind of traffic headaches they have to work through. But they really want to know what's going on with this pad equipment because you want that to work right on launch day itself. And so we're expecting to hear some more about how they're going to go forward. But still, it's a lot of headaches.
So I just want to point out a stunning metaphor to me. I guess you'd call it a metaphor, which I've mentioned before. I think it was on one of the beta episodes of this show. I was talking about. I had a graphic of how many Starship test launches took place while we were waiting to get an engine test finished on SLS. And so now once again we have this visual of the mighty moon rocket. And yes, I know it's new, sitting on the pad, trying to figure out how to get some fairly basic yet essential tests done. I don't mean to minimize it by saying basic, but fueling your rocket is an essential thing before you launch. While we have 3 or 4 SpaceX launches taking off across the driveway on Pad 39A, it's distressing. And as you say, it's a new system and you want to get it right. But Boeing's had a couple of tough years, and on top of this, we're still waiting for the Starliner to fly. Well, yeah. I hope they get it together.
And it's not just Boeing. It is like a full ecosystem because you've got the NASA ground system team that are working. You've got their subcontractors, and then they have to make sure that they have enough propellant because it is a huge rocket, and they can only tank it once or twice like they've done, and then they have to stand down and wait for more deliveries. That was a delay they had actually earlier in the second attempt. I think that was earlier this week, where they had just a delivery delay for the liquid nitrogen they need for pressurization. And that held things up for a few hours. So there's a ripple effect that comes down.
Yeah, there just isn't as much money to spend as there was during the space race. Next story, Webb or not Webb? So we have a little controversy over the James Webb Space Telescope, which is, do we call it the James Webb Telescope or not? Recently, it was disclosed that at least 400 pages of emails that were obtained reveal NASA's struggles to decide whether or not to rename the Webb Space Telescope, which was named famously after the second administrator of NASA, James Webb, who oversaw the building and earliest flights of Apollo, just missing the Apollo 11 moon landing by a few months when he was replaced. And there's a lot of accusations that he persecuted gays and other non-traditional folks in the 1960s at NASA, as was happening, as I understand it anyway, throughout the agency and in many other branches of the federal government. But there are some that suggest that James Webb had a particular concern about this. Now, it's clear that NASA knew something about this when the Webb was originally named the Next Generation Space Telescope, but I don't know if at that point they had actually made the determination of what the final name was going to be. I'm pretty sure one thing, they won't be renaming it the Von Braun Space Telescope for a bunch of reasons that we probably all know. But what do you think, Tariq?
Well, I think that NASA probably could have saved a lot of trouble if they'd been a much more transparent from the get-go. There wasn't a lot of reporting out when these protests came out and became a lot more forceful in the last year, leading up to Webb's launch, and then when NASA decided that they were gonna leave it the same, they really didn't put out a lot of information or backing about why or what the extent of their investigation was. So what this FOIA request that we're talking about right now, and this comes from a Nature story that came out this month, where they did request a lot of freedom of information documents from NASA about the extent of their investigation. They found something like 400 pages of emails where people were talking about all of this stuff and going through it, and they were aware of Webb's legacy, from from earlier times. Now, what we did hear is that the investigation is still going to be going on. There's some records that the NASA historian wants to get access to that maybe they haven't because of the pandemic or whatnot. That is a bit of an interesting statement, because if it was a federal investigation, you'd think they might be able to get access to those records even if things were closed. That's just my personal assessment. I would expect folks to acquiesce to a federal request for that kind of thing, but it seems like the door on the naming issue, wasn't as shut as NASA led us to believe when they kind of put out their response that no, we did our due diligence. It seems like they actually do have more that they need to do, and they were acknowledging that in a recent meeting even of scientists, where they were saying, yes, we're going to be looking into all of this stuff.
Well, it's interesting to know, and that came, by the way, that story was sourced from scientificamerican.com. Next up, from our friends at CNBC, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers suspended SpaceX's application to expand Starbase. Starbase, of course, is their massive facility down in Boca Chica, Texas, where they're building and testing starships. The Army Corps of Engineers said that they were suspending SpaceX's application because of incomplete documentation. This means that SpaceX won't be allowed to build a second launch tower, among other things. It also means that any commercial launches of Starship will have to happen from Kennedy Space Center, we think, with Starbase being used only for research and development. Now, in defense of the U.S. government parties, as I understand it, Starbase was originally sold to South Texas and the feds on the merits of being a test and assembly and perhaps launch center for the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. And the next thing you do, they're building Starship, which is a much bigger, potentially more dangerous spacecraft. And what they wanted to do would have required at least 17 more acres of wetlands and mudflats that the Army Corps of Engineers oversees. So these concerns focus on the environment, the wetlands, the animals there, and clean water. And the Army said that SpaceX can resubmit their application, but we couldn't get any additional details at the time of this broadcast. And at the core of this, the Army says SpaceX didn't provide the required environmental documentation. So in this case, I guess you could say SpaceX is being its own enemy, but I'm not sure we're getting the whole story here. So Tariq, what do you know?
Well, this is kind of par for the course where it comes to Starbase and SpaceX, because they've been held up there already with a Federal Aviation Administration review for environmental impact assessments, and that's been going on for just months. You know, it was supposed to be done at the end of I believe at the end of February, then the end of March. Now it's the end of April, and that was just for the existing setup there now, where SpaceX has a suborbital pad, a suborbital landing pad that they used for their tests of the early Starship predecessors, Starhopper, etc., and the early versions of Starship. And they've got a big pad there now with the current prototype for Starship that we think is the one that might go to orbit, but they may be building a new version as well of the super heavy booster and everything for it. But you know, you are right. When SpaceX first announced they were going to go to South Texas, this Boca Chica Beach place, it's very nice area. It's very pretty there. I've been there when they made some announcements in the past. They were going to use it for Falcon Heavy launches. So that's one heavy lift type of rocket. Now they want to use it for these orbital ones. They want to launch off the ocean off a barge platform. They want to catch rockets landing back here. They've already had a lot of growing pains with the nearby neighborhood, where I believe they've bought a lot of homes for people that have left over time, and that was all just for the current operations there now. Their plans for expansion to kind of scale up for Starship includes. I was reading The Verge on this. The two new orbital launch pads, 2 suborbital launch pads, a new landing pad, and other big changes to support this big rate of rockets that they want to be able to fly, and that they need more land for that. And that's a big change, even already up from the change that they had from Falcon Heavy. So I can understand why the Army Corps of Engineers is like, you know, hey, we really need a lot more detail, where SpaceX just really wants to go fast and just build to get up into space. Elon Musk did say earlier this year that if they hit environmental roadblocks, they would have to think about pivoting over to Florida, and whether or not they can do that on a swift timescale to meet not just their own personal targets for Starship, but also, you know, they're building Starship for NASA to go to the moon, and they even sold the first flight under the Polaris Dawn project to Jared Isaacman, the billionaire. So they've got customers lined up for this rocket. They really need to get their dots in a row to finish all the testing they need and wherever they're going to launch it.
And if I understood correctly, I don't remember which venue I read this article in, there is some possible concern about being able to launch Starship from 39A as well, which, if that's the case, would really put a crimp in their timeline. And I don't remember if that was environmental or if it was structural or if it had something to do with the safe radius from the booster, if there was a mistake during launch or what. Have you seen that?
Yeah. So I hadn't heard that, but I wouldn't be surprised, because it seems like I wouldn't be surprised if there would be some substantial downtime, because Pad 39A right now that SpaceX leases from NASA, I think it's like a 50-year lease for Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launches, is really geared towards those crew launches with those 2 vehicles right now. And the structure that SpaceX has built in Boca Chica to handle both the launch and the landings for early Starships is substantially different. And, you know, Starship is a lot taller. It's bigger than NASA's Space Launch System. And they would need some substantial support there. They would have to build one-way or another. And we know they're not building it yet because they've been launching crew flights from there. So they would have to stand down from the pad for a good time. So whether or not they would need a second pad or they could do something that's concurrent that wouldn't interrupt their flight rate would remain to be seen. And then plus they have these huge hangars that they built in Boca Chica for their Starship vehicles, for their super heavy structures, which they don't really have right now at 39A. They've got like a horizontal assembly building there that they use for Falcon 9, and they would need some more setup for that too.
Well, this is a story that will bear watching, because I think we'd all really like to see the orbital test happen before the end of the year.
Yeah, this year, that'd be great.
It already happened last year. So one last thing before we go to the break. I was talking about NASA's new budget request from the White House for next year. One little item popped out, which I hadn't really expected, which was mention of a journey to Mars, which is going to be our subject for the rest of this episode. What did you make of that bit of the budget announcement?
Yeah, the budget from NASA every year is always a really, I guess for me, an exciting time, because you can see what they want to pay for and what they really want to go after. And I know that you talked about the budget in general in a previous episode, but one of the things that really stood out to us at space.com was the fact that Bill Nelson, the chief of NASA, the administrator, and of course a former senator and someone who's flown in space before, did say that this whole budget and the things they wanted to do with it was really geared for them to getting someone to Mars by 2040. So astronauts on Mars by 2040, and that's what they're saying right now. And having a date like that comes from NASA, not from a politician or an administration at the top, was really interesting, because it kind of puts a new deadline out there for NASA in terms of their ambitions for human spaceflight that they didn't have before, and it gives them something to focus to. Gives us, as watchers of NASA, something to focus to too. So I think it's exciting that they have that there. I would like to see some progress to get to the moon as well. But having that there, and it's 2022 right now, so that's not 20 years out. I know we've talked about that in the past, but. I think it's pretty key to just point out that it's in their budget discussions now to do that.
Well, I guess if I make it that long, that'll be really exciting. And by golly, if I make it that long, I'll be almost as old as Administrator Nelson by the time we set foot on Mars. But that aside, we'll return with more about Mars in just a few minutes after a word from IT Pro TV, which is simply the best online training program ever. This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by IT Pro TV. The world of IT is colossal and always changing. Where do you start to get the updated certs and training you need? Whether you're a seasoned IT professional or just getting started, IT Pro TV is the online learning IT education platform you need to advance your skills in IT. IT Pro TV has 7 studios that film Monday through Friday. They have the most up-to-date content with every vendor and skill that you need to advance your IT career. Their courses go from the studio to the course library in 24 hours and are divided into 20 to 30-minute episodes for easy binging. They make sure you're prepared for your exams with their virtual labs and practice tests. There's really no better way to go about this. And the best part about IT Pro TV is that you learn and get certified on your own schedule, and it's actually entertaining to watch. Now, April is Linux month at IT Pro TV. Check out the on-demand webinar with Don Pizzette and Daniel Lowry, focused on choosing the right Linux distro in 2022. And IT Pro TV's Linux Free Weekend is scheduled for April 23rd and 24th, something you don't want to miss. IT Pro TV has over 138 hours of Linux training available. There are a couple of courses you may want to check out. Linux Shell Scripting Basics, LPIC 2 Linux Engineer, or Linux Command Line, plus so many more. And don't forget about your IT team. Check out an IT Pro TV business plan for your team today. Visit itpro.tv/twit for an additional 30% off all consumer subscriptions for the lifetime of your active subscription when you use code TWIT30. That's itpro.tv/twit and use code TWIT30 for an additional 30% off for the lifetime of your active subscription. IT Pro TV. Build or expand your IT career and enjoy the journey. And we're back. We're back to talk about humans on Mars. This is going to be a two-part episode because there's simply too much to say to do it in one. I was going to try, but when I think about all the ways we talked about getting to Mars over the past really 7 decades, and that's just talking about serious technical approaches. If you talk about wanting to send humans to Mars, you got to go back to the 18th, 19th century. But serious consideration for sending humans to Mars in spacecraft really got going in the 1940s. And so, Tariq, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell a little story about how that began.
I could use the history lesson, Rod, because like we were speaking, just a little bit ago. I know what's coming up right now that NASA wants to do, and I've even got an idea from the following that I had done. But I know that there's so much more out there that I just have missed over the years. So I look forward to it.
Well, I'll try not to get too waylaid into the past here, but it's a fascinating story, and I wrote about it. Insert small pitch here. I wrote about it in my best-selling book, "Amazing Stories of the Space Age," by now it's being printed by Rowman and Littlefield. It was originally out under Prometheus Books, available in a bookstore or an Amazon web page near you. Anyway, this really began with Wernher von Braun, who had come to the United States after the end of World War II, when he was done being a naughty boy and sending his explosive ballistic missiles all over Europe. We brought him to the United States and said, yes, you've been a bad boy, but we need you because we want to build missiles so we can send nuclear warheads to parts of Eastern Europe or Russia, if you will. Anyway, we brought von Braun and 150 of his closest friends over here and installed them out in the middle of the desert in New Mexico to build and test XSV-2s. So during that time, he had a lot of downtime while he was at this point, he was at Fort Bliss in the late 1940s. And he decided to write a novel, which was had the romantic and lyrical name, Project Mars, A Technical Tale. And so he wrote this science fiction novel, which was, it's got, I think, 186 reviews on Amazon. Now, it wasn't published until 2006. He sent this off to 18 publishers who all roundly said, hey, no thank you. And it's pretty impenetrable. It's got a very corny romance in it, and the lantern-jawed leader that's going to get his all men, to Mars and so forth. It's worth a look just for novelty's sake, but the important part of this fairly wretched novel was the fact that it had a massive technical appendix in which von Braun, thank God he didn't put it all in the main text of the story, von Braun calculated and showed how all this stuff would work. So most people that have read this book throughout, and I have to confess I didn't finish it because I kept nodding off, will tell you that it really looked like it was a framework on which, I think he did have pretensions to perhaps being a fiction novel writer, but I think really this is a framework for him to hang his idea of a mission to Mars on and sort of work through it and talk it through. And hence this large appendix, which did get published just a few years later, called The Mars Project, or in German, Das Mars Project. It was published in German in 1952 and then republished in English in 1953. And this was really the first, it's not a very long book. I think it's 80 pages, 60, 80 pages. The first really thorough look at how you might do Mars. It had some problems. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, so this is not like The Martian. When I think of like a book that explains how we live on Mars, people
no, not even close. Because you see, my friend, The Martian was entertaining. No, this is pretty. Even The Mars Project is pretty rough reading because it was a technical appendix, right? But it does walk you through, this fleet of 10 spaceships, 7 crew, 3 cargo. Landers, big winged landers that would glide down to the Martian surface, which I'll go into in a second. One thing about Mars, Project Mars, A Technical Tale, that was kind of outstanding, though, his fictional book, is that, get this, when he's writing about the government of Mars. So, and I quote, "The Martian government was directed by 10 men, the leader of whom was elected by universal suffrage for 5 years and entitled the Elon."
Wow.
I mean, as coincidences go, that's about as tight as it gets.
Yeah.
So,
and for our dear listeners, I think we're all in shock because, of course, Elon Musk of Twitter buyout fame and SpaceX and Tesla and Mars Dreams has been talking about Mars for the last 20 years. So, so it's kind of weird to see life imitating art like that.
So even von Braun, when he got the rejections from the book, was quoted as saying, "Readers who may have gagged a bit on the massive technical detail upon which they fed during the long voyage through space, this part of the story may offer opportunities for ruminative philosophical reflection." I can barely say it, much less write it. So anyway, I'll skip the detail on the novel because that's not important. But the Mars Project was important. Yeah.
Can I ask when von Braun wrote this, what was the year that he said we would be able to get to Mars? So if he wrote it in 48, when were they actually landing on Mars?
1980. And it would have launched from the United States of Earth. And the reason it was the United States of Earth is because, and this is kind of vintage von Braun, the Cold War ended when Luneta, the orbiting space station, dropped nuclear weapons on the USSR.
Wow.
And ended that threat by ending Russia. And then canals are discovered on Mars, and off we go because we want to meet the friendly Martians. And this kind of plays in this whole, it's kind of a thing I've got, this kinder, gentler solar system before 1965 and a couple of years earlier when we started sending robotic probes off to Venus and Mars and discovered, hey, these aren't just slightly warmer and slightly colder versions of Earth. These are god-awful, horrible places for human beings, very unfriendly to the human body. And the solar system just got more and more hostile from there on. All right, so the Mars Project would launch in 1965, had 10 massive spacecraft, 70 crew, 7-0, of course, all lantern-jawed military men, 7 passenger ships, 3 cargo. This was a conjunction-class mission, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but basically it means a quicker transit to Mars, but a lot more time at Mars. So they would have spent 443 days on the red planet. To assemble this armada in orbit, von Braun had designed a small orbital shuttle, which launched with chemical fuels. Didn't look at all like the space shuttle we know. It looked like a narrow cone-shaped rocket with wings. And it would have required 950 launches of that shuttle to put this thing together. So off they go to Mars with... there's a lot of interesting details, but he's got his fuel stored in collapsible bags to reduce mass and staging requirements and so forth. Chemical rockets, of course, still. Once they get in orbit around Mars, they use telescopes to pick landing sites on the equator. And then they send one of their gliders, and Chesley Bonestell did a bunch of artwork of these gliders. They look like long, sleek delta wind airplanes, kind of like the Concorde, with a huge wingspan. And this first glider would go to the North Pole, land on skis on the ice, making the assumption that the ice would be smooth and not destroy it. And after it landed, the rugged adventurers in it would unload their Mars tractor train and drive 4,000 miles after the first landing on Mars down to the equator. And once there, build a landing strip, and then the other gliders would land on the landing strip with wheels.
So it's not an ambitious plan at all.
Not at all. So then after their year and a half on Mars, they take the glider spacecraft, the 2 that landed on the equator, on the runway, and disconnect them from the wings, use cranes to lift them straight up. And of course, they're still supposed to be filled with fuel, which is why they were gliders, so they could land without expending fuel. And then they would have enough fuel to take the remaining crew, launch vertically, go back up to Martian orbit, and come home. And
they brought the cranes with them too, or they just built brand new cranes from the.
No, you just pack them along. How hard can it be? So, it was a massively ambitious thing, and yet when you read it today, you can still say, well, I can see how some of that would work, with one huge exception. They thought that the Martian atmosphere would be roughly analogous to standing on Mount Everest. So you need some help to breathe because it'd be carbon dioxide, high loads of carbon dioxide and so forth, but that there'd be enough atmospheric pressure that you could kind of exist there in a quasi shirt sleeve environment. Turned out once Mariner 4 went there in 1965 and ruined the whole party, the atmospheric density was about 1/10 of what was expected, and the gliders would have fallen like rocks, and that would be the end of the mission. But, it was glorious while it lasted. They also discovered that the radiation load was much higher than expected. But as I'm sure you've seen, Tariq, between 1952 and 54, Collier's Magazine, which was kind of a major publication in the U.S. at that time, did this great series on man in space, and part of it was the von Braun orbital plan with this incredible artwork by the space artist Chesley Bonestell, which was very popular. And then eventually, as you've seen, the Walt Disney Organization did a television show. I think that was also called Man in Space, and this was part of that, as was the von Braun moon mission. And that
von Braun was
for those
he was in that show. Yeah, von Braun was in there,
very
talking about
a little stiff, but I mean, he actually had a pointer stick, right? And his graphs on the wall. And when we get the rocket to Mars, I mean, he was spectacular. When you're a kid watching this guy, you're thinking, oh my God, it's the god of space. Then Walt would come out and say, hello, Werner, how are you? And I've always wondered if perhaps the federal government had a hand in getting that going. There's no evidence of it that I can find anywhere. But if you wanted to denazify and cleanse von Braun's public image for consumption as the leader of America to the moon, or at that point just into orbit, which is what we were aiming for, what better way than to enlist Walt Disney to put him on your TV show?
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me from that whole vision of these ships being built in orbit under von Braun's project was that he had envisioned this weird kind of ice cream cone shaped personal vehicle that people could fly around in as they built the Martian. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And just a really weird thing now is that there is a whole consortium of Blue Origin and Sierra Space and whatnot that are building a private space station called Orbital Reef. And one of the things that they are building is this single ice cream cone shaped one person vehicle, so that people that take a trip to that station can go outside on a spacewalk, if you will. And it's weird that we're getting there, at least some of it now, even though it's been 70 odd years or so since we first saw these visions there.
Yeah, it is, and I got to stop talking about the first phase of von Braun now, because I'm going to end up spending the rest of the hour doing that, and that would be not be a good thing. But I want to come back and talk a little bit, Tariq, about the number of studies we've had, because NASA picked up from this by sort of doing modified looks at how they might get to Mars based on a lot of von Braun's ideas. So we'll come back and talk about that shortly after a message from our valued sponsor, Blue Land. This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by Blue Land. Did you know that an estimated 5 billion plastic hand soap and cleaning bottles are thrown away each and every year? And as if that's not bad enough, each bottle can contain more than 90% water. That's a lose-lose situation for our planet. In addition to this, plastic has been found in 100% of marine turtles, 59% of whales, 36% of seals, and 40% of all seabird species examined. And get this, by 2050, scientists predict that the ocean will contain more plastic by weight than fish. Think about that. So it's time to start creating a cleaner planet from home. Blue Land's idea is simple and it's beautiful. You buy the bottle once, you refill it forever. There's no more plastic waste. The only thing you need to discard is your outdated idea that eco-friendly products are more expensive or less effective. You just fill Blue Land's beautiful Instagrammable bottles with warm water, pop in one of the hand soap or spray cleaner tablets, and within minutes you have powerful cleaning products in the most incredible scents, such as iris agave, perrine lemon, and lavender eucalyptus. I just got my first shipment of Blue Land products a couple weeks ago, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that I heard squeals of delight from my partner when she opened up the box, because these things are beautiful. These aren't just your usual plastic spray bottles. They come in a variety of very attractive colors. They're made from really high quality plastic that's going to hold up to a lot of use. And the idea that you can just put different powders and tablets in them to create the cleaning products you need really appeals to my environmental sense. It really is a buy once, use many, many times product. So from their best-selling Clean Essentials kit to their hand soap duo and plastic-free laundry and dishwasher tablets, Blue Land really does have something for every inch of your home. And now, backed by popular demand, is Blue Land's toilet tablet cleaner. Get it before it sells out again. Blue Land's stunning high-quality forever bottles start at just $10 when you buy a kit, and are meant to be reused forever with money-saving refill tablets that start at $2. Try Blue Land today. You'll love it, and your planet will thank you. Right now, you can get 20% off your first order when you go to blueland.com/space. That's 20% off your first order of any Blue Land products at blueland.com/space. blueland.com/space. All right, so talking about getting humans to Mars. By last count, NASA's done about 100 mission plans studied. And that's just NASA. Russia looked at this probably as much as we did. China's looking at it now. There's been a lot of studies done, and not to flog a tired horse, but if you stack the paperwork that's been generated to do this, you could probably get to Mars, or at least the moon anyway. Cost estimates have ranged from the high tens to low hundreds of billions to well over $1 trillion. And arguments prompted by various arguments have come out to alleviate costs, more recently mostly, about, we'll have space tourists going to Mars, or we'll do an international consortium. Space tourism is becoming a thing, but it's suborbital for the most part at this point, a little bit of orbital. And internationalism, well, hasn't been looking real good lately. We won't work with China, and we're probably going to have trouble working with the Russians anytime in the near future. So at this point, it looks like a U.S. and friendly nations project, at least from our side of the Atlantic. But let's talk a little bit about how you do Mars missions, and then Tariq, I want you to talk about some of the current stuff, and we'll come back next week and fill in the middle. Mars is a target you can only launch to about every 26 months because of the weird orbital dynamics of our planet and that planet. It has a very eccentric orbit as well. So there are 15-year cycles that relate to the lowest energy crossings. But as we've seen with the robotic missions, every 2 years you can launch something. The next low energy opportunity is in 2033, which we being NASA and the federal government, the U.S., probably won't be ready for, at least not with a crewed spacecraft of any kind. Elon Musk, however, might be. And one more important consideration here is opposition class versus conjunction class missions. So as I mentioned earlier, opposition class missions, and this is relative to the alignments of the planets at the time of launch, have longer transit times and shorter surface days of about 30 to 40 days. There's more radiation impact and weightless time, but you're not delayed on Mars as long. Conjunction class missions have less in-space transit time, but require 558 days on Mars, roughly, which is a long time. Actually, the high 400s to the mid 500s. So there are tables that list all this out, but in essence, you have to pick one of these types of missions, unless you're just going there to stay, which has been advocated by a few people in the past, but is not a terribly popular look on how you want to get to Mars, i.e., hey, it's a one-way trip, enjoy yourself. So these are pretty immutable numbers, at least based on current propulsion technologies. There's dangers to both. And let's talk about some of the dangers of doing this trek. So we've learned from the space station that being weightless for a long time is tough on the human body. And we know that once you leave low Earth orbit, radiation's a real problem. And that's something that is much worse than we had originally thought. So what's sort of the current state of affairs on long duration space flight?
Well, right now, what we're seeing is a willingness, at least on NASA's part, to have longer missions in orbit to study exactly what we're talking about. You mentioned the radiation environment, and that is something that NASA is going to get a really clear and perhaps even much more detailed picture of in the next 5 years as they start going back to the moon with the Artemis programs, because the space station right now flies, inside the Van Allen belts, where we have a bit of a protection from the most severe cosmic rays and solar radiation. But it's not nothing, and they know that over time, astronauts have a lifetime like a max limit of radiation that they can withstand. But otherwise, they're at a higher risk of developing certain kinds of cancers. The radiation, does affect their immune system, their eyes, everything about being in space for a prolonged series of time stems from that exposure to radiation and the lack of gravity there is gravity, right? But it's the weightlessness that they're feeling.
Right.
Because they're constantly in that falling frame. So you've got muscle loss, you've got bone density loss that NASA has some countermeasures for with exercise, with medications. They've noticed that astronauts can develop cataracts in their eyes, over time. Sometimes they go away, sometimes they don't, and they're trying to figure out why that is.
Now, excuse me, is it cataracts as well? I knew they had optical disc flattening. Are they also getting cataracts?
It's depending on their exposure rate. Like it's just a trend. Something that they've noticed is that they can develop them. Then they don't develop them while they're in space. They just develop them much later on when they get back. They're at a higher risk, if that makes sense.
Cataracts.
But yeah, their eye shape changes that we were just talking about that. And the radiation effects on the brain are something that they're really wanting to study and understand better, because they don't have that baseline of what it's like at Mars right now on the brain for those extended periods. We're talking about 600 plus days for that opposition class mission, 900 for that conjunction class. And that's a long time to be out of this safety field of the Earth's magnetic field and the that gives astronauts that are up there right now. Astronauts on the moon are going to have a higher radiation environment too. So NASA wants to study that as a precursor for these missions. So, and then you've got the whole isolation aspect.
Though, once you're on these bodies, the moon or Mars, there's two things. One, the fact that you're standing on a rocky surface blocks some percentage of, if not solar radiation, at least cosmic radiation coming from outside the solar system, because you're standing on a big rock, right? So it's blocking probably a little less than half of the radiation that would be coming at you from the open sky. But also, of course, you can either, we think, maybe find a cave or a lava tube, or certainly, as has been proposed by people like Pascal Lee and many others, send robots ahead to do sandbagging and build bunkers that have sufficient soil regolith between you and the radiation to dampen it out. Roughly, I think it's 15 to 30 feet, which is a lot. I mean, that's a lot of sandbagging, but at least that can be done. But while you're in transit, you're at the mercy of the protection of the spacecraft, which most of the designs, at least in later years, have had clusters of fuel tanks around the crew quarters, or at least part of the crew quarters, which would serve as a radiation shelter to try and mitigate this. But it's a real problem. And you can't just put a big metal hull between you and all those bad things, because the high energy particles that come in from outside the solar system cause, I think it's called spalling when they hit the hull, or can, which basically takes one high energy particle and breaks it into a number of other ones. Yeah. And so now it's, bathing you and your friends in a nice warm radiation bath. And some of these mission designs had you out there for a really long time. So in addition to the ones we've discussed, there was a study commissioned in 1962 by NASA called Empire, which, what did Empire stand for? I have it here somewhere. Anyway, it was an acronym for a big, long name for the mission.
Is it early manned interplanetary round trip expedition? I think I found it.
Thank you. Yes, there you go. Which was a very ambitious thing. So they had Ford Aeroneutronic, which was Ford's aerospace division back then, General Dynamics, and Lockheed bid. And I'm just going to discuss aeroneutronic because it's the most interesting and indicative. So basically, this would be a 21-month mission departing in 1970. It would use multiple Saturn V launches, up to 8 of them, or 1 or 2 Novas, which was going to be the larger successor to the Saturn V, which was never built, with perhaps as many as 8 F1 engines on it. The upper stage would use a Nerva nuclear engine, which we discussed in episode 1, atomic rockets, which would power the crossing to Mars. This was a big, expensive undertaking with a lot of custom hardware. A large main spacecraft stage with 2 racks of 8 propellant tanks. Some would be jettisoned along the way, and then some kept as protection for the crew against micrometeoroids and radiation. We thought micrometeoroids were going to be a much bigger danger than they are in open space, and we thought radiation was going to be less of a problem than it turned out to be in open space. The nuclear stage would be dumped after thrusting out to Mars. And then, quite cool, and something we don't hear enough about anymore because it's complicated, 2 booms would have extended from the central fuselage with crew compartments and spin up to provide about 1/3 of Earth gravity. So you are at least alleviating, we think, the worst effects of this zero-G crossing, and you're preparing the crew for what is roughly 1/3 of Earth gravity on Mars. Yeah. It would have had a nuclear fission reactor for its power source and a lifting body vehicle instead of a space capsule for Earth return. Now, this would have spent 630 days in space, but it would not have landed on Mars. This is simply to go around the planet and come home. Some trajectories had it just going to Mars. Some trajectories had a swing by Venus as well. There have been studies done of Venus, Mars, Venus, or just Mars and Venus. This is a long trip to have what would probably be a 10 to 12 hour flyby of that planet. Mm-hmm. Imagine spending 2 years in space so you could have this quick whip around Mars, the dark side, and this quick whip around Venus, which is, of course, covered with opaque clouds. So while it was very daring and cool, and just to be clear, they did carry drop probes. At least some of the designs would carry drop probes. So while you were rounding Mars, before you got there, you'd send off a bunch of robots that were supposed to land and collect samples and bring them back up to orbit, where you would pick them up as you swung by. One chance only, by the way. So if things didn't work exactly right, bye-bye drop probes, and then their atmospheric probes would be dropped into Venus. You know, for the time it made sense because robots weren't very reliable, but in the age that was just emerging from vacuum tubes and only about 10 years out from propeller airplanes, it's kind of hard to imagine that this would have worked, especially with people. I mean, we haven't even talked about life support yet. 2 years in space, breathing recycled air, drinking recycled water, all the things that we're still having trouble getting done reliably on the space station. Can you imagine in 1970? I mean,
and they didn't even have the recycling system that they've got on the space station right now for water, right? They would have had to carry all of that with them. So, we still shrug and cross our eyes a bit when we talk about Starship because, you know, for the long crossing to Mars that Elon Musk hopes to make in a few years, he hasn't worked out, as far as anybody knows anyway, his life support issues. So the idea of them doing it with 1960s technology just begs the imagination. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, you know, this is not an isolated mission design either. And we saw just in the 2013 timeframe, a new version of this flyby around called Inspiration Mars that was wholly dependent on sending maybe a crew of 2 to 4 people. I think it was about just two people around Mars, and it was the same type of a thing. It was a free return, I think, at that point. So that was they were looking at a 2018 launch back then, and it was very much like what we're looking at here with Empire, where you're quick, you go there, maybe you take some pictures and drop some stuff, but that's about it. And it's a long trip to just do that. And I think that's probably a reason that we haven't seen many takers for that on the government side, because if you're going to make the trip, you really want to try to get down there and walk around.
And notably, this was Dennis Tito, who was the first space tourist, quote unquote, up at the space station, right?
That's right. Yeah, Dennis Tito was the kind of project backer for Inspiration Mars in 2013, and he was working with a foundation. It was a nonprofit that was kind of really just raise the spirit of exploration and get people really excited about it. It did depend on, I guess back then, the what might have been the Ares 5 transitioning into the SLS that we have now. It depended on those rockets actually happening in an accelerated timeframe because they wanted to use them. And at the end of the day, they had needed government backing and they didn't get it, and so the project kind of fizzled out at that point in time. But these flyby approaches, we may not think of them as an option because we always want to send astronauts to walk around and drive around on little cars, and now I guess with ingenuity and perseverance, fly around on Mars. But it is an idea that people have been looking at just in the last couple decades too, again, to dust off.
And I have to say, well, in practical terms, at this point, especially back in the 60s, there would have been a lot to learn because we had only had the slightest robotic visits to these planets, in Mars in particular. Now, with orbiters permanently circling the planet and with a number of rovers on the surface, it's almost like this kind of Hail Mary, great romantic, humans in space, we can do it. We can fly around Mars and come home. So it touches the heart, but in practical terms, it's hard to understand what really would make sense about it. I remember when Tito was talking about it, one of the discussions going on was, look, you better send middle-aged people out there because if they're still in reproductive years, the radiation's going to scramble their DNA and do a number on them. But the older you are, and to be sort of rudely candid about the fewer years you have left to live, the lower your chances of getting debilitating cancer from your exposure. There's a lot more to be said here.
I would point out that Steve Squires, the principal investigator for the Mars rover's Spirit and Opportunity, had said a few times that having a person there instead of the robot, he would accomplish as a mission team leader as much science in like a week than they did in the 5 years that they were there because they could move around, walk around, go to different places. Right. So that has been, I think, one of the arguments from the science teams of why to send people, because of the autonomous abilities to do independent research, to assess on the ground really quickly and not rely on those 12-minute back and forth signal drains just to get directions on where to drive next. So.
And for a landing, I completely agree. But for a flyby, it's hard to make an argument for the amount of science that a team would get done in a multi-hour flyby. But once you're on the surface, human beings make the machines look like, even modern rovers look like total dummies, because we could cross as much space as the rover drives in a day in about 30 seconds. Well, we're going to have to come back and continue this, but we've got a lot to talk about, including NASA's march through the decades to the heralded theme of it's only 30 years away, and at least now we're down to about 18, so that's a big plus. And some kind of pop-out standalone things like Mars One, which didn't go anywhere, sadly, or maybe fortunately, and Robert Zubrin's Mars Direct, and a bunch of other NASA plans, and Russia and China. So we're going to have a busy week next week. But until then, thanks very much for joining us. You can find me, Rod Pyle, on Facebook, or you can find my magazine at Astro Magazine at the cleverly named @astromagazine.com. Tariq, where can we find you?
Well, they can always find me holed up in space.com mission control at space.com and on Twitter at Tariq J. Malik, all one word.
And that's good because the correct way to pronounce that, of course, is Tariq, which I once again didn't do. All right. Well, you can send us feedback at TWIS@twit.tv. New episodes of the show published every Friday on your favorite podcatcher, so be sure to go subscribe. You can pick which one you want, but Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and just about everywhere else I've looked. So go check it out and hit that subscribe button and tell your friends, because we welcome everybody. You can follow the TWiT Tech Podcast Network at TWiT on Twitter and on Facebook and twit.tv on Instagram. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week for Humans on Mars, Part 2.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.